Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we're talking about gliders again, but not just gliders. We're talking about wider airborne and SOE operations. And we had someone say on the last show, there's been a little flurry of American content. Well, there has been a flurry of American content, but now there's a flurry of British content. We've got Christopher Jarry coming on Friday. Jack Boucher's coming on a Friday in the evening, talk about his latest book and tanks in Burma. So there is British stuff coming, and it's all for the next couple of weeks about that. Getting into Germany 80 years ago, across the Rhine, across the German border, and by air and by amphibious and by artillery and everything else. Anyway, about 15 miles down the road from my hometown is Rivenhall in Essex. And Chris from Rivenhall 80 joins us to talk about the airfield at the time of Operation Varsity and its wider use by the RAF. So I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Chris. How are you today?
Paul, very well, thanks. Pleased to meet you.
Good. So, we were just saying, I grew up in Essex, and said there, and Rivenhall seems to have passed me by, or rather literally, I must have passed it by. And it's interesting how certain airfields, because the UK had shitloads of them in World War II, but some of them seem to be well known with thriving museums and monuments and books, and others just seem to have spent a lot of time being forgotten about. So before we get into the Varsity presentation, tell us about how you discovered Rivenhall and what you're doing to kind of get it back into the people's mind.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. So I served in the British Parachute Regiment for 25 years. And when I left 15 years ago, I settled in Essex. And it took a few years before I then realised that there was a former World War II base at Rivenhall. And I kind of started to delve into the history of it. And I realised, obviously, as most air bases in the UK, it started off as an American air base. And I'll cover that in a second. Before it then got handed over to the RAF. And it had an extremely rich history. The RAF aircraft there carried out special duties operations, dropping supplies and agents into occupied Europe. There were Horsa gliders based there for practice towing. And then they actually took part in Operation Varsity, where 60 gliders were towed into Germany, and as I say, 60 of those took off from Rivenhall. So my passion kind of grew once I realised that was the story behind it. There's been a lot of people in the local community who kind of helped my initial understanding. You know, there's been some great books written about it. There's this one here, written by a guy called Bruce State. That's quite an old book. But it's really good read, and it covers all the American aspects of it, plus the British aspects as well. So that kind of helped me get started. And then I kind of was really interested in military history, and I found by pure chance on YouTube and online these Imperial War Museum film footage of Operation Varsity. And I kind of thought, well, there's not that much footage of many other World War II operations. There was quite a bit there. And once I started unpicking it and looking at the detail in it, I realised the vast majority of that filming was at Rivenhall. And that really helped me, that drive me forward into really understanding what was what at the airfield.
Brilliant stuff. Well, you've come on with a PowerPoint, and we can do plenty of questions as well if people have them, folks. So fire away. But I'm going to hand over to Chris to come tell us all what he's been able to put together these few years about this this really important airfield. As it turned out, really important airfield that, as I said, was just down the road, and it seemed to have passed me by. But over to you, sir.
Thanks, Paul. So we'll start off on the first slide here. You can see a chalk drawing there that I doubt very many of you would have ever seen before. That kind of came up just in a random conversation with a little history group that I joined earlier in the year. And one of the family members came along. His dad was on Operation Varsity. He flew in as a glider troop. And he said that he had this fantastic sketch at home. He dug it out and he brought it in and he gave me a copy of it. And it kind of depicts Varsity. It depicts the Horsa gliders coming in from 2,500 feet into the village of Hamminkeln in Germany. And you can see in the top of the sketch the river and the railway, and they were the main objectives on that day. So that for me kind of set the scene for what Operation Varsity is all about. And I'll come back to that picture later on in the presentation. It really helps us visualize what's what. Yeah. So I'll go back to the book. Again, easy to get online. It's a really good read. It's not too thick. Plenty of pictures, easy to understand, but it tells a really good story Rivenhall, what is probably what most people would not know as a World War II airfield. It really goes into it in some depth. And, you know, that Bruce, and there was a smaller community. I never got to meet the guys that all moved on by the time I arrived here. Did so much for the veterans after the war. Used to have regular meetings at the base, etc., to keep the story going. So some really good compilations there from Bruce and those that edited the book. I really recommend it. So the airfield itself, then, what is it? So it was built to an American design in 1943. There's a standard design for all US airfields. Typically, US engineers would then come in and build them, but Rivenhall was actually designed by the Americans, but built by British civilian contractors. Not many had that accolade. So yeah, it's built by British contractors to the same standard that you'd expect. It became operational in February 44 with 363rd Fighter Group, who flew P-51 Mustangs, and they basically had just got the new drop tanks fitted, were able to escort the B-17s on the longer range bombing missions. They were very green, and you read Bruce's book, and if you actually go back to a Facebook page that I've got, I did an On This Day article on each. Yeah, they started off quite slowly, and they really got immersed into missions, and they lost a lot of pilots. They learned a lot in the first few weeks. That was in February 44. They were there until April, before the 397th Bombardment Group in the Marauders then turned up. And you see a good picture on the slide there of the Marauders there flying over Fearing Village, which is just around the corner from Rivenhall itself. And that picture is fantastic. That's like a personal photo that somebody gave me. I don't know where they got it from, but it shows so much detail in the village itself. And I just love looking at that picture and seeing what's still there now, and how that kind of was back there 80 years ago.
Just had a question from Gary August came in about, was the building of the airfield automatically qualifying it as a Class A group from conception? Because the 8th Air Force had various bases that some sort of developed out of smaller British ones. Some were built, brand new, but they have different specifications. So do you happen to know?
I don't. That's not a question that I could get back to. That would be in Bruce's book, and I could certainly try and find that out later on if that helps. Okay,
no problem. And I'm just thinking about that, the civilian contractors, because I'm an Essex born and bred. You're an interloper. No one moves to Essex. People move away from Essex anyway. Is that lots of the villages that kind of expanded in the 50s and 60s had the little roads built by the people who obviously were doing airfields? Because in my mum and dad's village, the little road that runs around there a little bit is that little bits of seamed concrete with the little tarmac seams that go down, just like the Perry tracks of the airfield. So obviously they carried on working in the explosion of post London, Essex and places like that booming. So you can still see bits of airfield tech, even not on airfields in Essex.
Brilliant. And actually, just while we're there, so as you're talking about the airfields, anyone that does live in the Essex area, you've got RAF Birch just down the road from here. You can still drive down the runway on RAF Birch. It's the actual runway itself is a live road. So that's, if you're on the area, do take a look. So yeah, going back to the Marauders, so they came in April 44, and they then started to really build the ground for prior to D-Day. They became known as the Bridge Busters. So towards the end of their missions, their main targets were bridges, highly effective, and they again suffered a lot of casualties, but carried out some very successful raids. They obviously took part on D-Day itself, as part of the bombing force on the day, and continued to use Rivenhall as their launch airfield until August 1944, when after they then moved further south before they're moving onto the continent. And Rivenhall itself was empty. It was left empty for a couple of months. So that takes me on to the next one. So we all know about Operation Market Garden, the part failure, part success that really halted the Allies' advance into Germany, what was planted into Germany, and where Arnhem became the front line and Nijmegen became the bottom front line, no man's land in between, and then the Rhine kind of boxing it off. And we kind of had this stalemate from September, October into October 1944. So when the RAF then carried out its supply missions into Arnhem, as we know from history, they got absolutely hit by flak massively. And two of the squadrons that were doing those supply drops were 295 Squadron and 570 Squadron of the RAF, based at Harwell, and they carried out supply drops on most of the days across Arnhem. They'd also flown in the gliders. They for some reason, so 295 Squadron, 570 Squadron always linked up with A Squadron, the glider pilot regiment. They were always based together, and they always flew together. So they did joint operations on D-Day, and they did joint operations on Operation Market Garden. And they all, for some reason, they always got chosen to do the hierarchy. So on D-Day, 570 and 295 dropped Pathfinders into D-Day, then came back and then did Mallard. On Operation Market Garden, the two RAF squadrons took Boyd Browning's corps headquarters into Grosbeak Heights. And the glider pilots of A Squadron then stayed on the ground in Grosbeak, apart from one flight that took a number of gliders into Arnhem. And obviously the rest is history, because massive casualty rates of glider pilots at Arnhem, massive casualties in the resupply drops. So 570 and 295 squadrons had loads of casualties, loads of planes shot down. And there's a period of kind of licking the wounds after the operation. But within a week, they got moved from Harwell to Rivenhall. And I find that quite sobering at times, because I think if I've been part of a large operation and a lot of my mates have just been killed or didn't come back, you want familiarity. You want to go down the local pub, or you want familiarity. But within a week, they were uplifted and moved to Rivenhall down to Essex. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember, that when the guys arrived at Rivenhall, psychologically, they've been through so much, and then all of a sudden they had to pick up the load and carry on.
It's interesting because, Chris, the glider pilots or the glider pilot regiment are, unlike some of the parachute battalions, have been through highs and lows. Because if you're 6th Airborne as a paratrooper, you've had a basically successful Normandy campaign. It dragged on a bit 3 months, and yes, lots of guys were killed and wounded, but it was at its core successful. If you're a 1st Airborne guy, obviously you've had Market Garden, less so. But the glider pilots have had, as I say, highs and lows, because they just go where they're sent for whatever operation is coming up next. So it's interesting that they've had in their brief career. I mean, the glider pilot regiment had only been around a couple of years. We had Mike Peters on a couple of years ago talking about the family, but they've been through some real highs and lows, from Husky and then Normandy and then Market Garden. And, there must have been lots of wondering about. So this whole concept of sending people in by glider, it clearly doesn't always work, but it obviously does work sometimes. So there must be lots of introspection going on at that time.
Absolutely. We'll come back to the glider pilot regiment pilots in a second. I'll touch base on what 295 and 570 squadrons ended up doing. So pretty much once they were at Rivenhall, they straight back into their operational tempo, still looking the wounds after Market Garden. And the main role was to drop supply containers into occupied Europe. And most of all the drops they did were into either the Netherlands or into Norway. And what aircraft did they use? So on the right there, we've got a Mark IV Stirling. It's a great picture. It shows the bomb bay door open.
Yep.
And in that bomb bay, you can carry 18 container light equipment, those things on the left. And I've actually got one here. That's the container light equipment.
Oh, cool. I thought it was the hot water boiler, but it's nice. Yeah, it's fantastic.
So those things will be filled with stores, weapons, whatever was needed on the ground. The Stirling can carry 18 in its main bomb bay, but the Stirling also had 2 other bomb bays on the wings, just on the inside of the inside wing, inside engines there. So if they were flying to the Netherlands, they carried 24 containers. If they were flying to Norway, they'd carry 18 because of the weight difference. And you can see in the picture on the left, basically the container just had a cradle wrapped around it. They'd fit it into the bomb bay as if it was just a normal bomb, and the bomb aimer would then be sitting in the front, and he'd just press the button when he was over target to drop the containers as if he was dropping bombs. You can see in the picture as well, where you can see the D-Day stripes at the back, you can see a square. That's the parachute hatch. So when they dropped the containers, they also dropped what was called packages. So anything that they couldn't fit into the containers, they basically made these bundles, and they had 2 dispatchers in the back that would then throw the packages out, usually about 3. Anybody that parachuted out of a Stirling also jumped out of that door. So that'd be paratroopers or SOE agents would also drop out of there. I don't know if you can see, but you can make out there's like a metal configuration poking out the bottom just by the door. That's a strop catcher. So when the parachutes went out, that would catch the strops from the parachute and stop it from fouling on the rear of the aircraft. And then right at the back, near the tail gunner, was a yoke that was used to connect the Stirling to the Horsa glider for communications. And the Mark IV Stirling was stripped of all weapons apart from the tail gunner. That's its only protection. So it was a real workhorse of Airborne Forces support. So who do they support on the ground there? So RAF Rivenhall, and I have delved into so many official records of unit records, war records, etc., to find out exactly what they did. And I was lucky enough to do a master's degree a few years back on intelligence and security studies. And one of the essays I wrote was about the Dutch SOE. So I ended up buying a few books, and this one here, SOE in the Low Countries. It's not cheap. I got it to study, but it's a really good book, terms of reference. It's got a list of all the people that parachuted out, where they parachuted into, and what their real names were, what their code names were. So I've been able to go into the war records where they'll basically say 570 dropped this agent on this date into this area there. I'll be able to go back to other books and then put names to agents. And there's a few. They started dropping agents in 1945. Before that, it was mainly just containers. But there's some real legends that dropped out from Rivenhall back into occupied Europe. This one here, Joss Gamek, she managed to bring some microfilm out of the Arnhem area just after the operation finished at Market Garden, smuggled them back to the lines, back to the Belgium lines, and then was whisked away back to the UK, became an SOE agent, and then was parachuted back in to the Netherlands from RAF Rivenhall in March 1945. She was injured during that jump. They probably dropped her at about 500 feet, and that's a minimum height for a parachute drop. And she hurt her back, and she lived with that for the rest of her life. So there's some real, as I say, when Rivenhall's got a rich history, it really does. When you join the dots as to who actually flew from there, dropped from there, there's some brilliant stories to tell. The picture on the left quickly shows you what happened on the ground. These containers that were dropped, they're quite big, they're quite heavy, they had to be hidden. The Dutch underground, you can see they're struggling with them through the polderland to get the stores out and then hide them afterwards. Okay, well, let's move on to Varsity. So we all know that after Operation Market Garden, they realised they had to do any major airborne operation differently. It just didn't work at Arnhem. The number of factors that were identified were they landed too far away from the drop zones and the landing zones. The resupplies, the way that they dropped those just didn't work. The fact they didn't manage to drop them all in one go, they had to do it over 3 days. There are just too many factors that led to failure. So the planners for Operation Varsity knew they had to get this right, and they knew that they had to learn from before. So Lieutenant Colonel Chatterton, who's the commanding officer of the Glider Pilot Regiment, very, very straight down the line, they say you always need to do if you're doing a glider landing, it's got to be coup de main. It's got to be straight on the top. There's no point in doing it otherwise. And he kind of was always forceful in that approach. He even tried to implement it on Operation Market Garden, but they wouldn't have it. So the planners for Varsity realised that they would have to drop the gliders and the paratroopers right on top of the objectives, and that's what they planned to do. So the gliders and the parachute aircraft, what I would call tactically loaded, so that the units that were going in knew exactly where they were supposed to land. They knew exactly what building they're going to take out, and they'd rehearse for that. So a glider would land next to a building, the guys then get out and storm that building. They knew that they all had to go in one go. They couldn't drag out the landing over a period of days. So over the months leading up to Varsity, the planners and the commanders made sure that they'd allocated enough aircraft to the squadrons in the UK and in France for the Americans to make sure that this could be done in one go. And it took a lot of effort and a lot of time to get the pilots trained, the aircraft in place, but it worked. Another big aspect of Varsity was, due to the losses at Arnhem of the glider pilot regiment, there's a real shortage of pilots, and they realised they had to fill that gap. And they went to the RAF volunteer reserve mainly and said, please can you give us some more pilots that we can retrain? And they were volunteers in becoming glider pilots. So you had a lot of budding Spitfire pilots, Lancaster pilots being told in their training sessions, you're now going to become a glider pilot. And the unique aspect of being a glider pilot in the British forces was that once you're on the ground, you then fought like a ground soldier. That was very unlike how the Americans played it. So, you know, these poor RAF volunteer reservists suddenly had to learn to become soldiers, and you know that they did it. You can't take it away from them. They stepped up to the challenge, and they did it. So everything was set up. They brought in some more operational airfields just for Varsity. It's the 20th. It's the 20th of March tomorrow. So I'll quickly touch on who was in the gliders and who jumped in from the Dakotas. Was the 6th Airborne Division, who obviously well remembered from the days of D-Day, who obviously the first on the ground. Very rarely do we remember the 6th Airborne Division going into the Ardennes, but they fought in the Battle of the Bulge. They were thrown in at Christmas in 1944 to go and fight there. And they were there until February 1945. And then they came back, went away for a week's leave, and then were back in getting ready for Operation Varsity. So, you know, it was a very fast turnaround for the 6th Airborne Division. The airfields that we used for Operation Varsity, you'll see in that on that sketch map that it's quite some tight lines at the top. There are 11 airfields in Oxfordshire and Suffolk. In Essex and Suffolk. So for the parachute aircraft, which were Dakotas, you had Wethersfield, Boreham, and Chipping-Ongar. That's where the Dakotas took off from. And then the gliders took off from Rivenhall, Earlscone, Great Dunmow, Birch, Gothfield, Shepherd's Grove, Woodbridge, and Matching. And Woodbridge was an emergency airfield. It wasn't your typical triangular shape. It was just one long runway used for emergency landings. That's where all the larger Hamel cars took off from, carrying bulldozers, Locust tanks, and all that stuff. The Birch and Gothfield airfields had Dakotas as tugs. Earlscone and Woodbridge had Halifax as tugs, and then the rest of the airfields were using the Stirlings that I've just previously described. So that's kind of the order of battle. In France, the Americans have basically shaped their airborne effort to take off from France. So taken off from there was the US 17th Airborne Division, who had also been fighting in the Ardennes. That was their first real taste of battle. They hadn't fought before that. And people will say, hang on a minute, there's only 2 airborne divisions here. How come this was the largest airborne operation ever? It's because they did it all on one day. the other airborne operation that had 3 airborne divisions, like Market Garden, took over a period of days. So this is always referred to as the largest ever airborne operation in one day. So out in France, we've got the 17th Airborne Division. They were going to use about 15 airfields dotted in and around Paris. They were going to be using the C-46 Curtiss Commando for the first time, which is larger than the Dakota, had 2 para doors, which allowed them to jump out the doors quicker. And they then had Dakotas that could double tow the Waco gliders. So because they were much smaller than the Horsa and the distances were shorter, the Dakotas were able to tow 2 Wacos at the same time. So that was a first for both. First time they used a commando, first time they double towed the Wacos. And they all took off on timings from the UK and from France. And as you can see on the diagram there, they then met up at certain points along the route and then flew in to their allocated drop zones and landing zones. So here's a map here of the landing zones that are marked in green, with the objectives marked in red. The map itself shows, so to the right of it, you'll see those red circles. The main objectives to the right there were bridges over the river and the railway crossing. The northern 2 circles, they were the main objectives for the Ox and Bucks. They did coup de main onto those bridges to take those. The third circle just below was the coup de main for the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, and then the larger circle that you can see there, that's the village of Hammingcalm. That was another objective. And then you've got further objectives to the west that I won't cover in detail. So for what we're worried about here for Rivenhall, the objectives for there, it was the village of Hammingcalm, and then the landing zone for the divisional headquarters, LZ Papa to the west. That was their other objective. So quite a lot to cover. The Americans were dropping the 17th Airborne Division to the southern part of that map there, and I'll come back to what happened actually on the day, because it had quite an impact on the day's events. So the Imperial War Museum footage I mentioned earlier, and I can actually put a is there a way of sharing a link, or I can do that afterwards, Paul?
I'll add it later. Yeah, send it to me and I'll add it. Yeah,
I'll do it afterwards. Brilliant. So that this footage that I mentioned before, with all the gliders being lined up in preparation for Operation Varsity, it was a real goldmine for my research, because of the chalk numbers that are on the aircraft. So for those that don't know what a chalk number is, it's literally a big chunk of chalk, and it's when an aircraft's allocated a task, it's got to basically make sure it links up with the right tug with the right equipment. So literally, you'd have a chalk number on the side of the glider and on the side of the tug, and then written on the vehicle, it was going to be a vehicle inside, so that they knew that gun goes inside that glider, and that glider is getting towed by that Stirling. And by watching that footage with all the chalk numbers, I pretty much managed to plot. This is my own scale model that I built for an event I'm doing. Watching that video and working off records on what gliders were where and what tugs, what Stirlings, towed some of the gliders. I haven't got all of it there because there's still some gaps, but it's
a proper really full-on geek making that, though. You know, that's full on. You know, nerd alert, but brilliant.
But the thing is, I mean, I had help. Obviously, I basically had a painting weekend, but these are all 3D printed stuff. Actually, it's been quite easy. You know, the airfield itself, you could do in a couple of hours. The 3D printing stuff, you know, it doesn't take long to do. There's a guy that printed them off for me. It was the painting that took the time. But yeah, it is geeky stuff, but it kind of helped me with my research. And I managed to figure out quite a lot just from building that model. Okay, so going back to the chalk numbers then. So you can see here on the left, there's a Mark II Horsa glider, which is chalk number 141. In the descriptor, it's got CN, that means chalk number. And the Mark II Horsa glider, very different from the Mark I. So for those that don't know the difference, the Mark 1 Horsa glider, basically, if you close that nose cone, the cockpit, to load up a Mark 1 Horsa, you had to drop down a big ramp, which is where the 141 is on the side there. That would drop down. You put a ramp in. You'd have to drive a Jeep in sideways and the gun to get it in. And then once you landed, you then had to blow off or cut off the tail section to then put the ramps down and drive it out the back. And they realised we've got to do better than this. So they looked at the horse and said, how can we redesign it? And we thought, well, we'll just open up the cockpit. And that's what they did. So that what you'll see in there is the Mark II Horsa being loaded with a quick fire 6-pounder anti-tank gun. And that picture there is taken at RAF Rivenhall. And I know that because I know that chalk number 141 flew from Rivenhall, according to the records. If you then go to the Imperial War Museum video footage that we'll send you the link to afterwards, there's a really good bit of footage where the cameraman is stood on the Stirling and he pans around and it stops on 141. And I'm like, geez, that is amazing that it's the same glider. And then there's this really famous picture on the right there of this quick fire 6-pounder gun in Hammingcalm. And lo and behold, it's got chalk number 141 written on the side. So that gun is one getting loaded into the glider there. And you can see that it reached the objective. The objective for that gun, I'll come back to the exact details of what the objectives were in a minute. That's it at the objective. So we know that gun made it safely to Hammingcalm. Okay. So what let's talk about the crews at Rivenhall then. So we had 295 Squadron, who basically, if I go back to 295 Squadron, basically towed the first 30 gliders. You can see the Stirling that's in the middle of the runway there, that's out of sync with the others. That's flown by Wing Commander Angel. He was the commanding officer at 295 Squadron, and he was the first aircraft to take off from Rivenhall that day, towing glider chalk number 121. And then they all left in sequence after that. And that they started taking off at 7 o'clock on the 24th of March. So the first 30 gliders by 295 Squadron. Then the next 30 gliders were towed by 570 Squadron. There were a couple that interchanged between, I don't know why, but that was a main kind of sequence to it. And who were they carrying then? So the first 11 gliders that you'll see lined up there, they carried C Company and Support Company, the 1st Battalion, the Royal Ulster Rifles. Now, C Company's objective was to take, in essence, the eastern part and the southern part of Hammingcalm. And so they landed just south of Hammingcalm in company strength. The Support Company, they were spread amongst across the battalions, but the main Support Company element that took off there was the Recce Platoon, the Pioneer Platoon, and the Mortars in the other 4 gliders. So that was the first 11 gliders. The next 21 gliders contained 12th Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment. So the 12 Devons is what I'll refer to them as. It's a bit of a mouthful. So the first 7 gliders of the 12 Devons contingent was D Company of the battalion. So D Company's objective was to land just to the west of Hammingcalm and fight their way through to the crossroads and seize Hammingcalm itself. And attached to them were 2 6-pounder guns. And we've just seen one of them in chalk number 141. Mm-hmm. So the first probably 11 gliders was D Company, and then the anti-tank platoon of 12 Devons. Then the remainder was there are 4 gliders who I can't pin down who flew in them from 12 Devons, but then the last 7 was C Company 12 Devons. Now C Company's task, they were detached from battalion, and their task was to land on the divisional headquarters landing zone and clear it before Div headquarters turned up. Attached to them as well were 2 gliders carrying the divisional headquarters defence platoon in chalk numbers 315 and 316. So they were attached to to C Company 12 Devons. After that, all the gliders contained divisional headquarters. The first 8, I think, were the General Officer Commanding, Major General Eric Bowles, and his kind of main element, and then the rest, it was bolt-ons throughout the division.
It's interesting, Chris, because you can see, going back to like Wellington's army, the British army's had a tradition of kind of how to move ground forces from continent to continent, and the order of march to some extent is kind of out of the manual for centuries. But in what order to bring in an airborne division, that they were learning it during the war because the whole concept was so new. And you can see for Varsity, to make sure you get mortars, make sure you get the 6-pounders up there in the right place early, because that's your punch, isn't it? I mean, to some extent, you're going to need reinforcement of paras, blokes on the ground later on. But if you haven't got your ability to fight with reasonably heavy weapons, as we found out at Arnhem, you can get really unstuck. So you can definitely, I think, you can see with Varsity, there's been, as you said, there's been learning of not just the actual organization of the lift, but the organization of which order to take stuff and where to prioritize.
Exactly that, yeah. And they took off in what was called airborne blocks. So when they were in the air, the airborne blocks would then come together at the right time, at the right place in the air, to make sure that they landed kind of in sync on the ground. Well, that was the in theory. It didn't quite work out like that on the ground itself. So that's kind of how it was laid out at Rivenhall itself. And as I said, they started taking off at 7 o'clock on the 24th of March. There was a couple of broken tow ropes as they started taking off. One of them, they were naughty boys. The SOP was, if you had a broken tow rope, you push the glider off. It waited until the end, and then it got towed by another spare Stirling at the end. You had Squadron Leader Stewart, who is due to tow chort number 333, because that crew had bonded so well with the glider pilots that were flying that glider in previous operations. They didn't want to leave him behind, so they literally stopped, crabbed backwards, hooked it up again, and off they went. And so it kind of delayed things a little bit. But once they were all in the air and on the way, they all got there apart from 3. There were 3 gliders who didn't make it, all with broken tow ropes. Glider 133, their tow rope broke over the UK and had to do an emergency landing. One of the defence platoon from the divisional headquarters, their tow rope broke just before the French coast. That was 315. So they had to land in France, along with one of the div headquarters gliders, 341. So only 3 didn't get to the battlefield. They're being towed. So I'll go back to the US 17th Airborne Division a bit, because they were, again, an equally sized force to the to the British 6th Airborne Division. There's a really good book called, where has it gone? "4 Hours of Fury."
James Fenelon, he was on the channel about that. Brilliant book. Yeah, he did a fantastic presentation. I'll link it. I'll add the link to it if I didn't already. I may have already put it in there, but great book and great guy. Yeah.
And, for me, that just gave me everything I needed to know about what the Americans did on Varsity. Fantastic book. So one of the parachute infantry regiments that the Americans call them, which is in British parley a brigade in essence, took a bit of a wrong turn at one of the checkpoints, and were a few degrees off as they flew into the drop zones, and they ended up dropping the 513th PIR complete a couple of miles north of where their drop zone was supposed to be, and they ended up landing on the divisional headquarters landing zone where all the gliders were supposed to come in. So all these American paratroopers landed on the Owl's Head, and they're immediately immersed into these skirmishes and battles. And it was, first impressions of the ground and the battle itself were horrific. It was not nice. There were lots of anti-aircraft guns, lots of Germans in prepared positions who knew this was coming. And these American paratroopers descended on top of them. A lot of them died. There were lots of images of them the parachutes hanging in trees, etc. But in my mind, I sense that if the 513th PIR hadn't landed in the wrong place, casualties in the British gliders would have been much higher than what they were, because I think the Americans cleared the LZ before the gliders landed. Virtually every single account of Operation Varsity, of when the troops coming in from the air, will talk about Monty's fog. So as we know, Operation Varsity was linked with Operation Plunder, which was the largest ever river crossing to take place. So pretty much an amphibious landing across the Rhine. And for 2 days beforehand, they've been laying this smoke screen to prevent the Germans from seeing what was going on. But nobody had thought to tell the air planners about this smoke screen. So when the airborne armada got over target, there was just smoke everywhere. It was about the smoke screen, but also mixed with the fog of war. And a lot of the proper drop zones couldn't be identified until literally the last minute. And it caused a lot of missed drops and a lot of things landing in the wrong place. But, that's just the way things were. The Americans, the whole American armada came in at 800 feet. The Curtis Commandos, the coaches towing the Wacos, they all came in 800 feet. And that was the height they came in at. The British had decided that the Paras would drop in at 500-600 feet, but the gliders were coming at 2,500 feet to give them better lens. I don't know, and that it was disastrous effects on a lot of the gliders, because they were literally sitting targets for a lot of the German anti-aircraft guns. Some of the Hamel cars, the much larger Hamel car, even had their tail fins painted yellow. They thought it was a good idea, so that when on the ground they knew that there was ammunition, etc., in that Hamel car, and easier to identify. I mean, that must have been a real lock-on for the German gunners. I just hate to think about it. Anyway, so Monty's fog caused chaos. People couldn't identify their actual landing zones or their actual drop zones until the very last minute. But the vast majority of the gliders did land in roughly the right area. So this sketch I'm going back to doesn't really depict Monty's fog there. I think that probably gives an image of it was nice and clear on the day, when the reality of it was much clearer. But
the fog seems to be the one thing that should have probably been allowed for, but wasn't. I mean, Varsity, as Monique said on Monday, was the Americans and the Brits getting most things right. They definitely, the learning curve was moving up. They learned. But it was a bit of a blunder, I think, to not have thought about that. And it was costly. And we also had with the Monique, I'm interested in your opinion, is that the flak was pretty bad, but in some ways it's one of the few things that Germans have left in strength, in that because anti-military batteries are fairly mobile and easy to hide to some extent. They've got a lot of stuff flying through the air, and the 20mm stuff, as which of course make gliders very vulnerable. But once the glider forces are on the ground, the Germans have much less to deal with it once the airborne part is open. They haven't got the tank divisions, they haven't got, like they did at Market Garden, that ability to counterattack. So the flak is some sort of its bark is worse than its bite in some ways. Does that make sense to you in your research?
Yeah, it did. And you talk about the casualties in the air were much higher with the British because of the heights that they jumped from. The casualties on the ground for the Americans were much higher because they dropped at a lower height, but therefore were straight on target and took the brunt. But yeah, the anti-aircraft guns, as you know, then it was a mix of the 88s and the 37mm smaller guns. And they knew that the Germans suspected that there was going to be an airborne landing somewhere in this area. They thought it was going to be a bit further back, where there was an old airfield. They didn't realise it was going to be straight on top of their main defences. But they had repositioned some anti-aircraft guns a few days before the operation took place, and that kind of brought concerns to those on the ground. But as we're going in, so going back to the casualties, there was one RAF Stirling from Rivenhall that was shot down. It was flown by Warrant Officer Horace Simmons. he was towing chalk number 127, which was the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles. And you'll see that in the Imperial War Museum footage. You'll see that aircraft taken off and the glider being towed behind it. In essence, the aircraft was hit by its on its port inner engine, was on fire, and Horace basically held it steady for the rest of the crew to get out. He unfortunately wasn't able to get out, and the plane crashed. But there's so many accounts of, as the aircraft were approaching the landing zones and the drop zones, of the Stirling coming back on fire and the parachutes coming out, that it was Horace's aircraft. There was only 2 Stirlings that crashed on Varsity. There was Horace's, and the other one managed to get back all the way to France before it crash landed. So it would have been Horace's as described. So the first 11 gliders, so C Company and Support Company, 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, took heavy casualties. They, as we know, were landing to take the southeastern part of Hammincown, and they landed slap bang, mostly on top of target. And there's some really good descriptions of their actions in the Pegasus archives, which again I'll share the link with if people wanted to see, go into that afterwards and have a read. There's one particular account by a guy called Paddy Devlin, who was a private in the battalion in C Company, and he very charismatic. He usually carried a sniper rifle. Had asked his OC, Major Hugh Weldon, if he could take a Bren gun instead, because he knew that he was going to be landing straight in amongst it, and a sniper rifle wasn't the weapon of choice. So his OC, Major Weldon, said, "Yeah, you can have a Bren gun, but you're not going to get a number 2. You've got to carry all your own magazines." So he basically carried 17 Bren gun magazines straight out the glider, and off he went. And his account kind of goes on that he got hit by a MG42 and was wounded, but survived. And it tells the story of how he kind of survived the day. But really also describes how ferocious and lethal the ground was on their immediate landing. From Rivenhall, we've got at least 52 names. I think it was 52 that died on that day on the landings, and we've managed to pin down most of those from Rivenhall. I can't attach most of the names, some of the names to the memorial that we're doing, but there's a lot of casualties. But they were successful. That they took their objective. The next set of gliders that came in were D Company 12 Devons, and they landed west of Hammincown, and the driving force was a CO who basically landed in around the same area and grabbed the company and was kind of driving them forward to get in. And some really good accounts of D Company's actions in the western part of Hammincown. As we know, there was 2 anti-tank guns attached to them, and there's an account where they were just getting to the crossroads, and one of the 2 church spires in Hammincown was pinning them down, and the CO disappeared and brought back one of these 6-pounders to then use against the spire to dislodge the Germans. And after that, then it all quietened down. C Company, who had been detached from the battalion to go and clear the divisional headquarters landing zone along with the defence platoon, didn't have a good time of it. When they landed on the ground, they'd already lost 1 platoon that had landed on one of the wrong LZs. Another glider, chalk number 150, was hit in the air and basically landed on fire, and everyone on board perished, unfortunately. So that was 27 guys dead before they'd even got anywhere. So C Company 12 Devons ended up having to clear the landing zone with only 2 platoons, and then one of the defence platoons, as opposed to a company plus. They kind of were really stretched. But as I say, going back to where the Americans had landed accidentally, a lot of that work had already been done for them. and then the RV was Copenhagen Farm, which is where divisional headquarters was going to work from. And the GOC's glider landed pretty much within a few feet of Copenhagen Farm. He landed right on target. His glider was flown by Major Hugh Bartlett, who was the OC of A Squadron. And they basically brought the glider straight in, and it had already become an American dressing station, so that they pretty much had the work done for them. And then pretty much within 3 hours, all objectives had been taken. So 3 hours for all objectives to be taken is pretty much unheard of in World War II kind of operations when you first start to do something. But it came at massive cost. We know that at least well over 1,000 died between the British, Canadian and US airborne forces on that day. And I don't know how many were wounded, but that's going to be even more. So it came at a massive cost, but it was what they knew they had to do. They had to go and do this. They had to land on top and take the target.
Yeah,
I'll come back to that slide in a minute. So people always kind of say to me, "Why is it the forgotten battle? Why don't that many people know about Operation Varsity?" There's a few things. First thing is, it was a success. We tend to not really talk about our
not enough controversies to make it sexy. Yeah,
exactly. The second thing is, I think that the news moved on. I think that once they started advancing into Germany, people reading the newspapers. Great, we're into Germany now. 3 weeks later, they liberated concentration camps, and the horrors of that emerged. 2 weeks after that, Hitler committed suicide. A week after that, the Germans capitulated. So Varsity had kind of been forgotten about, and nobody really then wanted to talk about it because of the horrors of the day and then everything else that happened. So that's why I think Varsity is kind of never really touched on. It's never really discussed. As a parachute regiment soldier, we were inbred with regimental history. We all knew about D-Day. We all knew about Arnhem. Very rarely did we know about Varsity.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head, hit the nail on the head. It went too well. It's not quite got those talking points for it to be brought up in pub. So except for Varsity went very well. Whereas you shout Operation Market Garden to a group of paras and airborne historians, and you've got a conversation that will last 6 hours because everybody's got an opinion of where it went wrong. But Varsity doesn't have that. Us Brits particularly are not good at examining the things that we do well at. We love our defeats. We love our heroic. We love Rorke's Drift, which wasn't a defeat, but it was kind of following a defeat. We love Dunkirk. We love Arnhem. We love that heroism in adversity. And Varsity, it kind of goes too well. Although, thank you for reminding us that it was costly. But that's the point. At this point in the war, with the Germans defending their homeland, you can have the paradox of a very successful operation, but still being costly. And I think that's what Varsity falls into. Yes, very, achieved all its objectives very quickly, but human life costly.
Absolutely. So just to finish off on my main bits, I've been lucky enough, to live next to a World War II airfield that people didn't really know much about, but also to understand the stories behind it. And I kind of, the stories galvanized me to make sure that on the 80th anniversary, something big was done. And I've been talking about it for a couple of years, and I got 5-6 months ago, then said, we've got to get this done. We've got to remember it. But not to people that I knew, just to try to generate this conversation. There's people in the villages around who kind of wanted something done. And, there's nothing left of RAF Rivenhall now, bar a few buildings that are left. It's mainly a big quarry. It's private land, but the landowners have been fantastic in allowing me to then hold a Operation Varsity 80th anniversary event on Sunday the 23rd with a memorial service on the morning of the 24th, and we're unveiling a new memorial in memory of those who took off there on this Sunday. And then on the Monday morning, we'll be laying reefs. So if anybody is in and around the area, you've been more than welcome to come. There's going to be military vehicles there. There's going to be a presentation on Varsity, unveiling the new memorial, a Dakota low-level flying display we managed to get on board. That's all going to happen on Sunday. with a, as I say, with a small service on Monday to remember those that fell.
Brilliant stuff. So, I wish I was back in Essex to do that, but James Jeffries is in Colchester. Maybe he'll pop down and see it. And I think you've done a fantastic job giving this operation a bit more attention, and Rivenhall a bit more attention. A lot of the questions kind of got answered as we went along, but there are a few. The first is, how did you get your drop canister? David asked that right at the beginning. Is it a real one? Is it a replica? Did he make it in the shed? Did he dig it up? What's the story?
Oh, I wish it was a real one. No, I think getting over a real one now is really difficult. So, cut a long story short, is a guy who lives near to me whose uncle died on Operation Market Garden. He was in 7th Battalion KOSBs, and he basically has got a World War II ambulance. He's got an old RAF 3-tonner truck. He's a great guy. And he's built these before, and I basically said, "I want one." And he basically said, "Well, look, I'll redesign it for you. I'll build a few. I can sell the others." So he that's where that came from, and he has got some others that he hasn't sold yet.
Brilliant. I remember when in my days with Airborne Reenactment, there was someone making up drop canisters. I think they were using a particular type of walk to make that kind of bottom part. I think back at the time, that was back in the day.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's a couple more questions and comments. So first thing is, and one of the things I love about this channel is when people who are watching have a connection with the subject we're talking about. So you mentioned MRD Foote in his book, and Philip Blood said right at the beginning, Dr. Blood said was an excellent historian, captured by the Germans in 1944. He was tortured. He went on to say later on how when Philip met Foote bought all the drinks for his students, which was fantastic. This comment, my dad's brother was in the 12th Devons and was in a horse glider on Varsity. He was 19 years old, so that's big eye. He's got a connection there. And Camden 76, grandfather Alvin Holderbecker was a glider pilot for Varsity, got a Bronze Star, so obviously American for his involvement at Burp Gun Corner battles. That's one of the ones that James Fenelon talks about in 4 Hours of Fury. Yeah. So that's 3 people who've got a connection with it, which is great. Question came in from Michael about Varsity, which I didn't think to ask Monique on Monday, and it's, what is the view that got put out there that it was an unnecessary operation, similar to getting forgotten about, in that things move quickly to a conclusion in Germany over the next 2 months? It does. I've heard that a little bit. It's not a regular one, but I hear more about Operation Dragoon in the south of France. Did we really need it? But Varsity, as you said there, within a couple of weeks, the British start liberating concentration camps, although the Soviets started that process back in February 45. But, the war is over within 8 weeks of this event. So have you read much about it being an unnecessary operation? And if so, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, every time I read it, there's a bit of me that says I don't like reading that, because I haven't been an airborne soldier myself. I don't like hearing someone saying, well, did it really have to happen? Because the loss of life on this operation was phenomenal. But, should it have happened? I think that Operation Plunder, which was quite a low casualty and a big success operation, I don't think potentially wouldn't have been as successful if Varsity hadn't taken place when it did. Reason being because obviously it's getting that foothold and then stopping the counter offense that the Germans were always good at. They were good at counter offensives, and it was stopping that in its tracks. So I think that if Varsity hadn't taken place, I don't think it would have been an easy river crossing as it had been. That's only my own personal assessment.
No, I think I agree. So one of the things we put to Monique, and I want to get your opinion on this, because 20 plus years in the parachute regiment, is this whole classification of what are airborne operations, and at what scale does an event have to be for it to be an airborne operation? And that things like we talked about Monday, Operation Bruneval, which are paratroopers jumping out of an aircraft, but I see it as a commander operation. From someone who was in the regiment and did it, in your era, did you have a kind of a good understanding and a concept of when airborne becomes airborne and when airborne isn't airborne?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I think we think back to the Second World War. Airborne forces had only been operating for a couple of years, so they were in their infancy from 42 onwards. So it was always going to be a smaller operation for biting because they didn't have the manpower, the resources to do it. I think as they kind of then built on the forces and the resources and the aircraft, and actually I thought about this a few years ago. I think did the British Airborne Forces in the Second World War become too big and clumsy because they were supposed to be shock troops? All of a sudden, you then get given 17-pounders and Hamel cars and everything, and you become this like massive chain around you. But you want to be that punchy kind of force. So I think to be a punchy kind of force, is it just a coup de main attack where someone else is currently behind? Wouldn't have been a total airborne operation, but because the size of the operations that we saw in D-Day, Arnhem, and on Varsity, obviously they were airborne operations. Since the Second World War, as we know, the last kind of operational parachute drop as a battalion was Suez Crossing in 1956. Although airborne forces have been operating with UKSF. And you will never know when and where they jumped, but they have jumped in the past couple of decades.
But it's kind of back to the smaller scale things, isn't it? It's gone back to that, how it started, essentially, the insertion of kind of teams rather than, as you say, transporting an army. And of course, the fact that gliders as a concept were just outdated by helicopters and air assault, as Americans would call it, became an evolution of the airborne idea with a slightly different methodology, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think it's a very ethos of airborne forces is that, you're going to be dropped behind the lines. You've got to be able to look after yourself for 3 days and waiting for the cavalry to arrive. That kind of ethos and being able to kind of work independently, I think, is the future of airborne forces, be they parachuting in, coming in by helicopter or anything in the future that kind of deploys those troops. Is the ethos. And
it's like with the Royal Marines, is that concept of doing something in training that separates you from ordinary people. And even though learned people say, of course, well, the British Army is never going to be jumping large numbers of people by parachute again, which may or may not be true. The idea of, standing in a balloon as it used to be, or going up in an aircraft and I haven't done it, but the thought of it kind of terrifies me. And it is a method of separating the wheat from the chaff. And I think that it's not surprising that a lot of nations around the world still revere their parachute forces, even if they don't particularly jump out of aircraft. In operationally, it's an ethos, as you said. That's it. It is. So we've got one more question coming, then we'll bring things in. So William asked, during your research, were there any odd or otherwise interesting findings that you found out that happened on Varsity to British forces? In 4 Hours of Fury, for example, OSS operations were mentioned. Were there any SOE or obscure parts of Varsity that you discovered?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that bit about OSS going in the Waco glider, I just thought, when I read that, I was like, they're doing what in a Kubelwagen? And it was like,
Monique mentioned it on Monday. Crazy.
So no SOE went in. It was if you think back to Market Garden, you had Jedburgh teams that went in with the teams there. That was kind of the first application of something that's slightly different attached to. Nothing like that happened in Varsity. There's one really good story though. There's a friend in the village. He's ex colonel in the Guards, really nice guy. His uncle was based at Earlscote. He was the OC of B Squadron Glider Pilot Regiment. His aunt also happened to be based at Earlscote as a ground crew. And prior to Varsity, they did a lottery for the ground crew to say, oh, who wants to go up in one of the tugs and see the battle? No, everybody was talking about it. And she won the lottery win. And there was a massive kerfuffle, it's probably the best way of saying it, about a woman going up in the aircraft to go and watch the battle, because it was all men. And in the end, they were like, well, she's got to go. She won the lottery. So they had to hide her to get onto the aircraft to go and watch the operation. And the Halifax that she was in got hit and had to crash land in France. And she then had to be smuggled back to the UK as an SOE operator, saying she's important. She's got to get back to the UK. just to hide the fact that she'd been on the aircraft. It's a great story.
Wow.
Great story.
It is, and it kind of, although it's got of a humorous element and scary element, it kind of alludes to the fact that by 1945, although there's obviously going to be combat to come, there is a slightly more, I'm not going to say relaxed, but the outcome of the war seems to be fairly certain. It's not, we know we've gone from the dark days of watching Heinkels flying over English and Britain and Scottish and Welsh cities. It's kind of, we've seen the Germans being pushed back and back on the map. So you start to read in the memoirs and in the war diaries, there's a certain amount of playing hard and allowing things like lotteries to take place, and security, letting locals on, the 8th Air Force would let locals onto the bases much more later in the war because the danger is kind of gone and the outcome. So I think Varsity falls into that category, as well as there being a sense of, even if this little bit doesn't go very well, the outcome of the war is still
be in our favor.
Yeah,
I agree.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we will end it there. Folks, I'm back earlier tomorrow. Dr. John Coratola is on 10 o'clock his time from New Orleans, but that's 3 o'clock UK time, to talk about Operation Flashpoint, which is our first look at actually getting American troops across the Rhine. And it is the last chapter of his Armies Afloat book. So he's basically suggesting that all the amphibious landings Americans did in Husky and Salerno and Anzio and Normandy were basically a prelude to the biggest amphibious operation of all, in some ways, which is getting across the Rhine. So I'm looking forward to his thoughts about that and how the Rhine crossing is essentially an amphibious operation. But in the meantime, for those of you who are anywhere near Essex, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, whatever it is, head yourself down to Rivenhall this weekend. And thank you, Chris, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.